The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, so thank you for joining today. My purpose is we published at VinaCapital, we published a research report yesterday with our updated view of the impact of COVID on Vietnam in light of what's happening in the rest of the world, et cetera. And my purpose today is to really share as much information as possible about the research that went into this report, which was quite a volume of work, and also to open it up to questions. I'll pause at certain points along the way to see if anyone wants to either have questions or even elaborate or even contradict some of the things that I've said. I'll mention that at the outset that I first talked about this topic to the BBG back in January. At that time, we were predicting that the tourist arrivals in Vietnam, if you looked at what happened during SARS, if you looked at what happened in Asia during SARS, and at that time in early January, it seemed to be kind of playing out in a similar way. And we were predicting at that point that tourist arrivals would fall by about 10% this year. And during the Q&A, Ken Atkinson said, "Hey, no, we see much worse numbers, and from a bottoms up point of view, and the people that we're talking to. So by all means, if anyone has any granular information that contradicts what I have to say, please let's be able to share it with everybody." I got a summary here. How do I go forward with this from each slide to slide here? Okay. Okay, so the summary of what I'm going to talk about today is the idea that, first of all, Vietnam is the most open economy really in modern history. And so for that point of view, what happens in the rest of the world really, of course, domestic things are important, but what's happening in the rest of the world is even more important than any sort of domestic things that we can talk about. This current crisis really emphasizes that. That's the first point. The second point is that, and I won't elaborate on that because I think everyone knows that already who's living and working here. The second point, which you might not know, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I'll just touch a little bit on the idea that contrary to what you may have believed, the condition of the U.S. and the world economy was actually very poor coming into this. I know that the U.S. president always saying all these kind of hyperbole, blah 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 stuff, but the reality is that the economy of the world was actually in a fairly precarious position coming into this. So this is it was really a worst possible setup to have this happen. The next thing is, and this I will spend more time on, especially as far as Vietnam is concerned, that there's a growing consensus that the GDP growth, the hit to GDP growth from COVID, there's a growing consensus that in the U.S. and in the EU, it's going to be about a 6 percentage point hit. So we're looking at growth in the U.S. of probably minus 5% this year, and so far in Germany also looking for minus 5% growth. Some of the other the other European countries are not. There's not as much consensus. We yesterday cut our GDP forecast down to 4 percentage points, which would mean that COVID would have a 3 percentage point decrease on growth this year. Actually, that even when I published it yesterday, I had the gnawing feeling in my stomach like that might be too optimistic, and already I'm starting to think like maybe we need to revise this down again like a week later or something, because just the way that things are playing out in the Western world is horrendous right now. And then the optimistic good news, which I'll also spend a bit of time working on talking, is that actually post-COVID, of course, it's a terrible humanitarian tragedy that's happening right now. Our sympathy goes out for everyone affected. My sympathy goes out for your prime minister, whatever your feelings are about Boris Johnson. We don't wish any negative things on anyone in the world. That having been said, I think later people will look back and they'll say that Vietnam was kind of doing okay, just kind of, I wouldn't say bumbling along, but doing reasonably well. And then COVID was something after everything finishes. Obviously, we're in the middle of the medical emergency still. So I'm talking about starting from about a year from now, people will later look back and say, wow, that's strange, because that terrible humanitarian event ended up something that actually ended up putting Vietnam on a higher growth trajectory. And that's not empty happy talk. I know people have seen my presentations before. I often have very positive long-term things to say about Vietnam. I really think that's the case, and I'll get into a little bit of details why I think this is going to shift us onto a little bit of a higher trajectory. I'm going to take a little detour before getting into the economics topics to just mention a few of the medical aspects you may have not heard in the newspaper. You know, there's a lot of information floating around these days. Although I am the chief economist at VinaCapital, my own personal background is I have quite a heavy science and mathematics background. My sister actually works at the Yale University Hospital. She's on top of a lot of this stuff too. And just purely coincidentally, many years ago, I mean, we talk about 30 or so years ago now, 25 years ago, when I applied to the applied mathematics program at Harvard, and I was accepted to and then later dropped out of, but the topic that I was focused on that time was epidemiology. We were focused about the AIDS epidemic at that time. And so although my knowledge is really out of date, I do have some background in this stuff long time ago. And so here's some things which you may or may not have known about. The first point is that, you know, this word asymptomatic has come into all of our lexicon now. And what we keep hearing over and over is that the COVID is, there seems to be a consensus that it can be asymptomatic for 2 weeks. So you get infected and you don't show any symptoms for 2 weeks. Actually, there's really strong evidence that the asymptomatic period is much longer, probably 4 weeks, 1 month. And something I didn't write on here is that you will be the most infective to other people typically about before you show any symptoms. So when you catch it, you know, for the first week or two, when you're not sneezing or anything like that, that's when it's easiest to spread to other people. And that leads into the next point, which is another term that probably many of us know now, is this the so-called R naught, which is when one person has it, how many other people do they spread it to? Somehow the consensus that you read in the mainstream media has kind of zoomed in around this 2 times number, maybe 3 times. But there was some research all the way back at the beginning of this from Los Alamos, which is a place that they do bioweapons research in the U.S., among other things. And they had said right from the outset, look, this has an R naught of, you know, 4 times, maybe even possibly higher than 4 times, and that information seems to have just gone, you know, from the public discussion now. The next piece of information is that there really is concrete evidence now that the COVID is airborne because they stay in the air for even hours. The WHO, I think, is still putting out information that it's not airborne. In my mind, the WHO has just completely discredited themselves throughout this whole thing for, you know, both political point of view and science point of view. But there is research now from MIT and from some other places. There was a very exhaustive study in China where they had this terrible story, but they had one bus. It was a long distance bus. This is in January before things really came out, and there was one infected person, and there was a camera on the bus so they could see very precisely where it went to. And another sort of piece of information that's not so well known is people on this bus were getting infected at sort of 4 meters, 5 meters away. So what we've been told is if you're 2 meter distance, it's safe, and that's probably not the case. So that's all really negative and you know, very pessimistic, and it means that, you know, the spread of this is probably much more widespread than what we've been led to believe. The good news, if you want to call it good news, or I guess I should say the less bad news, is that an exhaustive study of this Diamond Princess ship outside of Japan, on that ship, the mortality rate was about 1%. And so that was with people who are, you know, older and probably more predisposed to health issues. There's a guy at Stanford University, which is my university, who is coming out with the idea. It's a hypothesis so far. There's no science behind it, but he's saying, look, there's probably a lot of people that already had it and have recovered and don't realize that the tests that we're doing right now, the so-called PCA tests, tell you if you have it right now. If we were testing people's blood, we'd be able to tell if they had it and then already recovered. So his hypothesis, this is literally just a few days ago that this is, and it seems to be getting a little bit of traction. His idea is that, you know, the mortality rate could actually be much lower than 1%. That having been said, for people that are on a respirator, I read some research this morning, unfortunately, that the survival rate is about 30%. So I really hope that your Prime Minister Johnson that's not his situation. And the very last thing I'll say on this topic is that there's all kinds of research going on. And one of the most promising strains of research that I've been reading is the idea that you could take the blood of someone who already had recovered either from COVID or even from SARS, who had SARS and recovered from SARS, because it's also coronavirus. You spin out the antibodies in their blood, and you can use that to then treat or use as a vaccine for other people. And there seemed to be some really promising research along those lines. So a little bit more pessimistic, a little bit more optimistic thing there. So okay, sorry, I know that's not the main focus of our talk today, and I know you've all read stuff in the newspaper, but I mean, my sister and I have literally read hundreds of pages of medical and epidemiological research. So we wanted to share with you a little bit of that. Based on everything that we've read, we're pretty convinced that the medical emergency in the U.S. will peak in May. I think you see more people talking about that now. By the way, that means that probably the stock market is going to go down more, because you can't have in my opinion, this is my opinion, it's very difficult to see the stock market stabilizing while there's still these death rates are going up. The idea of mutations, probably this is going to come back again in the autumn. But when we watch a science fiction movie, or also when we think about the terrible experience of the Spanish flu, we have the idea like mutation can make the thing much worse. Actually, in most cases, mutation going to make it less lethal. So there is a hope that when it comes back, it will be less. And then the last thing to mention is that we assume, based on the measures, I think you have to really give the government credit here for what they've done in terms of flattening the curve. So we really, you live here, so we started having a lot of concern about this all the way back in January, and so they've succeeded so far in their objective of not letting the number of cases get over 1,000. But because when you flatten out the curve, you stop the peak, but you also spread it out so that it takes a longer time. So we think that based on our own little crude models, that basically this is going to go until the end of Q2. And not before the end of Q2. So that's probably when the worst of the epidemic will pass for Vietnam. And then these theories that sunshine and young demographics could help us out as well here. By the way, regarding sunshine, there's one, the common sense widespread theory is that the sun kills the virus. There's another theory that says that the sun activates the body's own defenses. So there's those two lines of research being pursued. And sorry, before I get back to the economics point, I just want to mention one last piece of research that I have not seen a lot discussed, is the idea that if, God forbid, you were to get infected with COVID, or a person was to get infected with COVID, it turns out, and this is a nascent line of research. There's not a lot, all these things are new. There's not detailed studies about any of this, but it seems that if the so-called inoculum, or the viral load, if the initial amount, I'm talking about the physical amount of sort of virus particles that come into you, is relatively low, it seems that then you're going to have a less of a difficult time with the injury. And so the idea of wearing face masks, even if it's not like a perfect N95 mask, something like that, even if you're able to block some of the particles coming into you, you will apparently have a much easier time of it if the initial exposure to the virus is less. So, for example, if you caught it by touching a surface that someone else had touched, probably the number of particles that you're going to pick up is not so great that time. And you may get it, but you won't get it as severely as someone who is like the people on the bus that I mentioned in China, where they were just breathing in what this guy was expelling. Okay, that's enough of that. Let me get back into the economic stuff, which is supposed to be what this is about. And I'll remind you, I think most of you know this, that in Vietnam, when you add up our imports plus our exports, It's 200% of GDP. This is the biggest of this trade flow of any big country in the modern history. So I'm not including places like Singapore and Hong Kong. That doesn't count. So whatever happens in the world, we're going to get impacted by. The second thing, which I don't think a lot of people realize, is that when you add up the amount of foreign capital that's been flowing into Vietnam in recent years, it's humongous. Already this number, this sort of 6, 7, 8% of GDP of FDI number, which kind of rolls off the tongue now. People didn't even really contemplate. These are humongous numbers already. Japan, Korea, those countries in their heyday, they never had more than 1 or 2% of GDP of FDI. So you take that humongous number, a lot of the money that comes in remittances, it's not like the Philippines where people are sending money back, to be spent. This is essentially capital flows. A lot of that is going into buying an apartment and stuff like that. So you add up money coming into the stock market, all these things together, the amount of capital flowing into Vietnam is humongous. And so this is a big vulnerability for us in terms of, what happens in the rest of the world. On the manufacturing sector, we went from, in the beginning, back in January, we were talking about supply chain disruptions, because about a third of the inputs that we need in Vietnam to make stuff here comes from China. And now, of course, our concern is that that's still there. I mean, China's supposedly getting back to work, but we'll see how that goes. The numbers in China, by the way, are not off by a factor of 10. They're not off by a factor of 100. They're off by much, much bigger factor, and there's a lot of evidence about that. So, I mean, they're struggling to get their production back to work, but we'll see how that goes in terms of us in Vietnam being able to source inputs from them. And of course, now our concern has flipped to the supply side, so to the demand side, and how much stuff are we going to be able to sell to the make and sell export to the U.S. and EU. I'll talk more about that later. Surprisingly, really, it turns out that the biggest vulnerability for Vietnam is the tourism industry. And when you think it through, you have to do a little bit of a thought experiment about this. But when you think it through, we think about like the manufacturing sector as sort of more, modern, and that's where the country is heading. And, tourism is about some hotel and small restaurant. But actually, the value add for every dollar spent in the tourism industry is actually really high, because you're essentially paying people local wages, or maybe local plus a bit type wages, and you're essentially selling goods and services to foreigners at what are essentially foreign prices, or let's say foreign minus a bit prices. So there's a big chunk of value there that gets captured in the country. When you think about manufacturing, you're paying people local wages, but there's an intermediary there. There's a very sophisticated multinational company that they're gonna squeeze every bit of value out themselves that they can when they export those products off to the rest of the world. Of course, manufacturing has many other benefits. It's a path for the country to get more wealthy as we build the local supply chains here to make more of the components that are used as inputs here locally. I'll talk more about that a bit more. But my point is that today, right now, the hit to the tourism industry that we're expecting, this is actually a really big deal in terms of the hit to Vietnam's GDP growth. And of course, the last thing is about the domestic consumption is going to be hit by what's happening here now in Q2, and I'll talk a little bit more about what we expect in terms of recovery later in the year. So these are where we see as the main vulnerabilities of Vietnam for COVID. So I plant those thoughts in your head. I'm going to take a detour and talk a little bit about what's going on in the rest of the world, but I wanted to plant those thoughts in your head now before I come back and discuss them in a bit more detail later, so that if you have some ideas or thoughts, you can already be forming them in the back of your head. I mentioned what may be somewhat of a maybe surprising for some people, or even a controversial thing for me to have said, is that unlike what is widely believed, the U.S. economy in particular was in actually really bad condition already coming into this. And in fact, we had a period at the end of 2018 where it really looked like sort of all hell was about to break loose. And then what 2019 was essentially about all the world's central banks, especially in the US, but even in Europe and other banks, reversing course. So in 2018, they were saying, hey, we need to calm it down, shrink it down. There's too much debt. Let's try to get things under control. And the reaction of the world's stock markets and economies at the end of 2018 was so severe that essentially the whole last year was about pumping things back up and trying to keep everything together. And of course, you can't do that in the face of the COVID. This is a topic I can have a whole presentation about and talk about for an hour. So, that's not the point of what my discussion is with you today. So I'm only going to highlight just a few very key points to illustrate the vulnerability of the U.S. and the world economy leading up to this. And the first thing is to mention that, over the last 10 years before COVID, essentially what happened is the U.S. Federal Reserve basically conjured out of the air about $4 trillion of money. Fancy way to call that is a quantitative easing. And then what happened was companies in the U.S. essentially, I shorten the story, but essentially companies basically took that money and they used it to buy back their own stocks on the stock market. Over the last 5 years, the U.S. stock market has gone up 50%. But if you look carefully, there's actually been no profit growth in the U.S. over the last 5 years. What's happened is there's been the profit per share growth has gone up, and that's just because companies keep buying the shares and kind of flushing them down the toilet kind of thing. So that gives you an indicator about how weak the U.S. economy was coming into this. And the last slide I'll mention on this topic, this is the companies, the Russell 2000 index in the U.S. is so you have the 1,000 biggest, so there's the S&P 500 is the 500 biggest companies, and then Russell has the 1,000 biggest companies, and then these are the next level down. So if you consider like the 3,000 biggest companies in the U.S., this is the bottom 2/3. So these are companies that are really more exposed to what's actually happening in the real economy. And what you can see here on this chart is there's just been a dramatic, increase over those last 5-6 years of the proportion of smaller companies in the U.S. that are losing money. And so that really is another way to think about how unhealthy the U.S. economy was kind of coming into this whole thing. I could again have a whole nother hour discussion about how weak Europe was coming into this. I mean, that is just too much. I think you probably in the UK you had a sense of that already. The very quick comments I'll make about this is the idea that everything you've seen over the last 10 years in Germany is basically Germany just wants to keep the EU together, because if the EU were to fall apart, the value of Germany's currency would soar, and that's a real export-oriented economy. So they really do whatever they can to try to keep things together. Japan, you may know that the economy at the end of last year was already shrinking at 6%. That's partially because they raised the VAT. China, this can be literally not one presentation, but two presentations about how weak China is. But you all know the story about how many empty apartments, empty cities. They've been building these bullet trains that go nowhere. The point of my last two slides here is to say the world came into this COVID situation unfortunately in a really weak position, and that's part of why things are really falling apart so quickly as they are, and also coupled with some policy mistakes and things of that nature that I'll talk a little bit more about. Oh, sorry, how do I go backwards? Okay. Okay, there's some research out of Harvard. There's tons and tons and tons of both economics and medical research over the last 3-4 weeks. There was a research paper published at Harvard 2 weeks ago, and what they did is they went in and they tried to really figure out what was the economic impact of the Spanish flu, and I mean the Spanish flu in and of itself. Of course, there was a lot of other things going on in the world at the time. World War I was still going on, and what they found out is that in a very wide range of countries, U.S., Germany, even in Asia, that the Spanish flu tended to reduce GDP growth by 6 percentage points. Now, the medical of COVID is thankfully not as bad as Spanish flu, which you could just sort of die from in 10 hours type of thing. But then on the other hand, the world is much more interconnected now. So the second bullet point was not the point of the Harvard paper, is my point, which is that maybe those two impacts end up kind of comparable, and we end up with that COVID also reduces GDP growth by 6 percentage points. That seems to be what the consensus that's coming out. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there is really now a consensus that the U.S. will shrink by 5% this year, which is sort of double what it did in 2009. And there's also a whole nother line of research based on looking at what happened to the U.S. economy in particular after 9/11, looking at how long it took for this is several there's several papers on this, several research on that, not just one or two. And unfortunately, it really looks like this is going to be something that, even after the immediate sort of medical issue is out of the way, is really going to be with us for 2 or 3 years, 2 years minimum. And that's based on looking at things like after both the Spanish flu and 9/11, how long did it take for employment to come back? How long did it take, when you have one of these kind of events, people's natural reaction is to start really aggressively saving money. And how long did it take before people kind of eased up and they started, the savings rate started coming back down to a more normal level, things of that nature. So it really is kind of a minimum 2-year, and that's after, the event itself is over, or almost all over. Spanish flu, by the way, was not completely eradicated until the 1950s, but the immediate, traumatic was over by 1920. Okay, I'm gonna now go on to, or my plan right now is to go on and to talk more about what's relevant to us with all that. Now you have all that backdrop is about COVID and what we think about for Vietnam this year. But I want to pause for a moment before. Was there any questions that came up at all yet I should address before getting into this topic, or nothing yet?
They can type.
Okay. I think you have the ability to type questions if there's anything anybody wants to ask. I will go on now to talk about, which was really kind of the meat of this report that we just published yesterday about what we expect for Vietnam. With the proviso, as I just mentioned at the opening of this, that we ran scenarios in which we saw some really terrible numbers, like 2% growth this year, or even worse. So right now, do I need to go forward? Okay. So right now, we did come out with a 4% GDP growth forecast, which I thought was below consensus, but I saw that Standard Chartered, I think yesterday, just came out with the 3 something percent forecast. So far we had been the most pessimistic throughout this whole thing, and now they're even more pessimistic than we are. So as I mentioned at the outset, the real vulnerabilities are for manufacturing, for tourism, and for domestic consumption. Obviously, at the moment, all restaurants are closed, etc. Let me talk a little bit about manufacturing. The concern there has really flipped from a supply side concern to a demand side concern, and the thing I think to keep in mind here is that Vietnam, we have this kind of interesting, because the evolution of FDI was so rapid over those last, in the scheme of things. I mean, it might not seem like it in a society like this where everything is always so dynamic and moves really quickly, but it was such a rapid acceleration of FDI over those last 10, 15 years. So we have this interesting kind of barbell structure to the products that we export. We like to, especially when we are a firm, when we have conference calls, and now we're having a gazillion of them, as you can imagine. When we have conference calls with investors in New York and London, we often like to tout the fact that, hey, about a third of the stuff that Vietnam exports is high tech, lots of the Samsung phones and digital cameras and stuff. So we really want to show like the future of the country. But the reality is that we still have a huge legacy of things that we make that are essentially low value added products like garments, footwear, cheap furniture, basically stuff that gets sold in places like Walmart. I mean, that is still really our bread and butter, the bulk of our exports. And of course, the way that that evolved is because the first wave of FDI was really focused in those kind of low value added things. And what you're seeing now is it doesn't sort of just all pick up and go to Bangladesh and Cambodia in one year or something like that. There's been a steadily dripping of those kind of the production of those sort of lower value added products to other cheaper destinations, but it is still the bulk of the things that we export. And so this kind of barbell structure where we have a bunch of stuff at the top end and a bunch of stuff at the bottom end, in this kind of a crisis situation, what we saw in 2009 is it ended up being, in some small way, sort of insulating us against the full trauma of what was happening in the rest of the world at that time. And we already see evidence that that's probably going to be the case again this time around. There was something that leaked out of Walmart literally a couple days ago, and I guess a kind of an internal memo that someone then leaked to the press for whatever reason. I'm not sure why they would have leaked this, but because it's a fairly benign piece of information I'm about to share with you. But this I don't think has really been publicized yet on like Bloomberg or CNBC or something like that. But according to this internal memo, first of all, Walmart's revenues in the last 4 weeks are up 20%, and their online revenues are up 30%. That's probably not so surprising, given that people really stockpiling before, in advance of the lockdowns and stuff. But what's interesting is the Walmart themselves, and as you know, they are just, I mean, they're so data fanatical there. They have humongous volumes of data that they really, understand how to analyze and get into in depth. And basically what they're seeing is that there was kind of an initial wave where people were, really buying things like hand sanitizers and, medical oriented, things for immediate health concerns, coupled with a slight lag, people stocking up on canned foods and, things that they'll need in quarantine. And now what's happening is there's a transition towards people, who are locked down in their homes, buying gadgets to kind of, entertain themselves or keep themselves busy. Things like iPad, some home gym equipment, maybe some cheap furniture that they wanted to, cheap desks they want to assemble. Now they have the time to assemble it, this kind of stuff. And that bucket in particular, the Walmart, the first, not the first few categories, but the next category is probably going to include a lot of things that are made here in Vietnam. And so for that reason, we're really not expecting there to be, export growth has already had a big drop. And in the first quarter of this year, what we saw in the GDP statistics, and there'll be more of a drop this quarter, but I don't expect that to, unlike tourism, which is just going to keep sort of drop all year. I mean, it's going to be horrendous and it's not going to recover. But I think with manufacturing, what we're thinking about is, it was like an airplane that just sort of hit an air pocket. In Q2, we'll dip a little bit, and then we'll probably come back a little bit especially Q3 and towards the end of the year. So that's how we think about the manufacturing. The next thing to mention about manufacturing is that so we're making all these things that we export to the rest of the world. Our exports will for sure be down this year. In the GFC, they were down, I think, about 8%, if I remember correctly. And now I want to loop back to a point that I made earlier, which is that, although we like to tout all this modern manufacturing activity that's happening here, and although I'm strongly in the belief that this is the path for Vietnam to get more wealthy in the future, because right now we're sort of, the manufacturing industry right now is, we have call it around 100% of export, 100% of GDP worth of exports, but basically about 100% of GDP worth of imports. And it's a little bit less because we have a trade surplus, but these are humongous numbers. And so what that means is that essentially what's happening here is we bring in all these components that are made in, Korea, China, Japan, and then we use cheap labor to sort of assemble it. And the value add from that is, I mean, it's very valuable in the sense that it employs a lot of people. This is for sure very important. But the value add to the economy from that activity is not actually that high. So even though we will for sure have some, sorry, let me summarize my views on this topic in two steps. Step one is resiliency to exports because of this barbell structure, because we're making and selling a lot of Walmart type stuff. That's step number one. And step number two is that even when exports go down, assuming that you don't have mass layoffs, which we don't expect, then the impact to Vietnam's economy is not as much as what you might expect, because unfortunately, I mean, fortunately for this situation, but unfortunately for the country as a whole, the value add from that is not that significant. So that's how we're thinking about manufacturing. The tourism, I kind of already talked a lot about that. Right now, we're thinking minus 50% arrivals. That's based on what we hear from like ACV, Vietjet, from the government themselves have put out some. I think the Civil Aviation Authority has made some assessments about that. And then regarding the domestic economy, we think that a drop of domestic demand basically shaved about nearly a percentage point off of GDP growth in the first quarter of this year. And I'm going to choose my words very careful now. A lot of economics geeky type words get thrown around. And I'm going to talk about a very subtle distinction between domestic demand, which is what people want, what they want to buy, and domestic consumption. And these are the transactions that are actually occurring. This is what's actually happening. So technically speaking, what we see reported in the GDP statistics is actual consumption, domestic consumption. And the reason I mention that that slight distinction is because we're quite convinced that the medical aspect in Vietnam is really going to let up in at really around the end of the current quarter, so around the end of June. Okay, and how we're thinking about this right now is if we think about how we came into this. There was already you could observe a little bit of impact around the middle of February. There was probably no impact at all in the countryside around the middle of February. Some restaurants had like a little bit less people. And then during the month of March, starting with the sort of patient 17 and by the end, the full sort of shut lockdown by the end of the month, things got just progressively tighter and tighter as March went on. And that's kind of how we think that June will be sort of a mirror of that. So we'll start in a fairly tight condition. Things will be more or less continue to be locked down until around the end of May. You see now hotels saying no flights, or sorry, Vietnam Airlines saying no international flights to the end of May. Some 3 5-star hotels saying we're planning to be closed down to the end of May. So things continue to be fairly tight until then, and then June is sort of a mirror image of what happened in March. We went down in March, and we'll come back up throughout the month of June. Now, I think what's going to happen is that again, we don't want to belittle anyone that got sick, and this is a terrible human tragedy. We cannot emphasize that enough. And I mentioned earlier, my sister works in the Yale University Hospital. I mean, it's terrible what they're getting hit with. But the reality is, given the young demographics, given the weather, et cetera, here, and the good public health measures, and frankly speaking, that we already accustomed to wearing masks in Asia and this kind of stuff, we actually don't think the medical situation here is going to be as severe as in some other countries. And so I think what you have happen at the end of June is really a V-shaped recovery in domestic demand. So I think that as soon as public health measures ease up, I mean, people are just going to want to go out and go to the restaurant and spend. And in my case, really need to get a haircut. And I saw that on Google now. One of the most searched terms is like DIY, do-it-yourself haircut. I may be in that situation soon. So I think there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand that wants to get unleashed right away in early July. But unfortunately, a lot of mom and pop businesses are not going to survive these next couple months. And also, we could still be looking at some restrictions on domestic movement of people. I think goods is not really in question. Even now, I think goods are flowing fairly freely. But those two things together make us think that rather than having like a V-shaped in demand a V-shaped in actual economic activity and consumption, there'll be a V-shaped a recovery in demand, but you won't really see consumption pick up until Q4. So Q3 is likely to continue to be anemic. And I'm going to say one more thing before I pause for questions, because I think I see a few now popping up, is that yesterday we had the government come out and talk, the initial amount of fiscal stimulus they were talking about was about 0.5%. And I mean, that's just because they were so preoccupied with all the public health things that were going on. So, kudos to them for that. And then, they now we came out, I think yesterday, they started talking about 3% of GDP. To put that in context, we spent about 5.5% of GDP in the GFC of fiscal stimulus. The way they spent the money during the fiscal stimulus was, in the end, counterproductive. That's a whole other story by itself. I am honestly not really sure what they can do fiscal stimulus wise. I mean, some of the things we're hearing, okay, cut utility bill, that seems good. Make some payments to people directly in as much as it's possible. I can talk more about this if anyone's interested, but it's a whole other topic, that the fiscal stimulus that the U.S. has done or has announced so far is going to be a disaster, and probably even make things worse. I mean, it's just terrible what they're meant to bail out small businesses, and you have people like Hilton going out and pretending that, oh, Hilton, we're not a big company, we're a series of small companies. So they're going out and getting this small business aid. And there's tons of shenanigans like that going on already in the U.S. And the people that need the money can't get the money. And so I'm concerned to some extent that whatever measures the government wants to do here could be difficult too, if for no other reason than people. Not everybody has a bank account here, so I am a little bit worried about how effective this 3% fiscal stimulus they're talking about could be. This is just, I should be careful right now what I say. This is my initial impression. We haven't dug deeply into it, so I want to be careful that I'm not evaluating what they're doing, but just that's my gut feeling. I do have a very well-informed view, however, that the quickest, the most effective way that the government could really support, and it's almost the wrong word to use the word stimulus, because stimulus implies you're trying to push things up. Really what you're doing is you're trying to prevent things from falling as much as they would have. What the government could immediately do is to really ramp up infrastructure construction. I mean, just get on it right away, because all the money is just sitting there. I mean, they've raised, probably about 6-7% of GDP worth of money to spend on this that's just been deposited back in the commercial banking system. And that's something that would be, relatively easy for them to kind of just pump it up right away. I mean, I know there's all kinds of internal issues that have been blocking it. I mean, my answer to that would be just, this is not the time to, you see in the US, I mean, when they took this is a bit of my pet peeve right now about how things are going in the US, but when they did the vote on the fiscal stimulus, $2.2 trillion, the most amount of money, they didn't even take, for the House of Representatives, they didn't even take a vote. They just said, well, just assume everybody's passed it, something along these lines. They didn't even count everyone's vote. So I think that we're in a situation of kind of unprecedented measures are being taken. So whatever measures are necessary we're not naive to what the blocks have been, but we would say just push that to the side. And similarly, for the real estate sector, where we had a big slowdown of development activity there because of these corruption crackdowns. And, there's certainly going to be some projects that they really need to be looked at carefully, but there's probably a huge swath of projects that, they could just unleash that tomorrow. And I think those would be the two ways that they could, stimulate things the quickest. Okay, I see. I'm going to talk about the dong next, the Vietnam dong, but I think before I go on to that, let me see if there's any questions, except for anything about the dong, because I'm going to cover that. Okay, good question. Um, unfortunately, I do not think that the tourism industry is going to bounce back next year. So I think that there won't be a further decline. Um, and I mean, that's not helpful for people that are in the tourism industry, of course. But again, this is a 2 or 3 year problem. And the first year, I think people are still going to be really shell shocked. So from an overall economy point of view, I mean, this doesn't help you if you're in that industry. But from an overall economy point of view, the dramatic drag on the Vietnam GDP growth this year because of the drop in tourism, just arithmetically, if you don't get a further drop, but things kind of stay the same in tourism next year, just arithmetically, you don't get a second hit to your GDP. So you sort of took all the hit this year. But unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be a strong rebound in tourism. If you look at you look very carefully at passenger traffic after 9/11, which is probably the closest analogy. It really was about 3 years before it fully recovered. And in the first year, there was basically no recovery. So I think next year is going to be also very difficult for the tourism industry, unfortunately. Oh, sorry. Yeah, good point. Yeah. Okay, so the next question is, you said Vietnam is the most open large economy. Is that because Vietnam depends heavily on export and FDI? Yeah, I don't want to make this my answer too long. I think some of you may know this. When I first came to Vietnam, I taught in the National University in the math department, and so I have a little bit of that kind of academic-y type. So sometimes my answers get too long. So apologies about that. But I will tell you something that you may not know. Especially given that I'm speaking to the British business group, is that there is an economic model that that all of the Asian tigers followed, which is called the East Asian Development Model. And this economic model was actually pioneered by Alexander Hamilton in the U.S. when we wanted to kind of have. We'd already won the Revolutionary War, but we wanted to have less economic influence from England. And the idea of the East Asian East Asian development model is, and this is what the U.S. did in the 1800s, what Germany did, what Japan did both before the war, and then Japan did again after the war. So the idea is that a government first they put in agricultural reforms and land reforms, and so when there's land reforms, you find that your agricultural productivity goes up. And so you have a little bit more excess that you can export. And then what the government does is it takes those excesses and they essentially channel these newfound excess wealth that the country is producing after the agriculture sector starts to get more productive. They take that and they channel it into the manufacture of exports. So that's what the model is. So first you improve your agriculture sector. Once things start going better there and you have more than enough food to feed your people, you sell it to the rest of the world, you get some money for that, and you take that money and you channel all of it into producing things that you can sell to the rest of the world. And this is the only kind of demonstrated way to get rich quickly. Now, what the Chinese did is they observed that hey, this East Asian development model, seemed to work well over and over. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to supercharge this by introducing FDI, because up until that point, foreign investment was not part of the story. As I mentioned earlier, Japan and Korea basically had no FDI. And so the Chinese observed that, or experience that, hey, when we bring some FDI into the story, we make the thing go quicker, and that's why China's progress was so quick, starting from around 2000. And then what the Vietnamese policymakers very astutely, I think, realized is, hey, FDI seemed to work well and making China's progress go quicker. Why don't we do even more of that? And so that's why you see that, for example, about 75% of the industrial base here is FDI funded. and that's I think in China was around a third or something like that. So everything that worked for China, we did even more. And so yeah, it's a long answer to your question, but that's the reason why we have more exports a percent of GDP. Did I read the question before I? Yes. I did. Okay, thanks. Okay, when do you expect business activities to resume? So we have to be very careful to distinguish between domestic business activity and tourism. And that's why on my slide here, I mentioned domestic consumption growth, and I put in parentheses there. This is what we're trying to get at here, is things that for local people to buy and sell stuff. And you don't want to say anything that's going to make me seem insensitive or that's going to get me in trouble. But I think that business activity in Vietnam is going to rebound very quickly. I think that now I'm in Saigon, and I know that the clampdown in Hanoi is more both because the weather and closer to China and more cases, and that's where the government is. So I'm not as well versed to speak about that. Nor should I probably, but if I speak about from sort of the middle of the country down, I think what you're going to experience is something that in the paper we just published yesterday, we called quarantine fatigue. And the idea is that in the US already, and things haven't even really progressed that far, you have, let me try to remember the numbers. It's a really dramatic difference. There's something like a bit under half of the people think, okay, COVID is a health, is a threat to the nation's health. Something, I think it's under half, if I remember correctly. But a much, much higher proportion of people are concerned about the impact on the economy. And you already start to hear people talking about, okay, it's terrible that a certain number of people are gonna be affected by this. Probably the mortality rate is considerably below 1%, but what's the trade-off between how much we damage people's even their health? Because if you don't have money, you can't afford medical care, right? So I think those kind of I think the Vietnamese government is probably a very good position to think through those issues and make some very pragmatic decisions. So I have to be careful what I say. So, okay, thanks. I have to be pragmatic with what I have to be careful what I say, but I think domestic business activity is going to rebound very quickly based on what I see so far. But I don't think tourists are coming back soon. Okay, the next. Okay, yeah. All right. Your research report suggested there may be an unfreezing of the real estate market, which will help supply, despite there being pent up demand. Okay, unfreezing of the real estate market, which might help supply. Yes, I think that's true. Despite there being pent up demand from foreign investors, that I'm not sure about. I think there's a lot of pent up for domestic, and I don't know if that's what we said in our report, but okay, let's say pent up demand, and the middle class, due to the lack of quality. How do we go down? Launches in the last 1.5 years. How do you send? I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. It says, how do you send demand for residential units amongst the fallout from COVID-19? I'll re-answer the last question a little bit more directly, and hopefully I try to stay diplomatic, given that I'm in the British consulate. I don't think the impact of COVID on business activity is going to last within Vietnam amongst locals is going to last that long. Is my answer. I mean, is it going to stop people from buying an apartment in July? Absolutely not.
Okay, just resend the question. How do you see
Oh,
the
okay, yeah. What is your view of the impact of COVID on Vietnamese banks? Yeah, we have a lot of discussions about this inside VinaCapital, and we're not really clear. I mean, it is a bit worrying, the explosion of consumer finance, especially at some of the subsidiaries of the banks, because maybe it will be a bit more difficult for people to if they're not getting their salary check to make the loan payments. In general, though, I don't really think it's going to be a big impact. If anything, if this real estate thing plays out the way that we hope it will, you could have some acceleration of lending. I guess the other, sorry, I'm going all over the place here. Another thing is that, I mentioned that I think a lot of mom and pop businesses will suffer. Probably if you're an SME who is already robust and tangible, robust enough that you could borrow money from the bank, I think you're probably going to be in a situation that you can probably survive this. So the mom and pops that will go under will probably be the ones that were not in a position to borrow. And so I think so far, we've had a lot of discussions about this, and honestly, we have not come to any conclusion yet in our own discussions. And I guess what you could take away from that is we don't think there's an obvious threat to the banks. I think I'll leave my answer there. Yeah.
There are more questions on the stock market as well as management.
Actually, I had something about the stock market in my report, and
we might save for later.
And it got taken out. Let me say. So let me say this. Let me say this about the stock market. I think it's going to 600. And I don't know if I'm supposed to say that or not because it might sound too bearish, but I think we're going to 600. At 600, the valuation would be around 9 times PE ratio, which would be about the same as it was at the bottom of the GFC. That's one thing. The other thing is, how can the U.S. stock market be holding up where it is now? Despite all the pump liquidity, all this kind of stuff, when you start to see, we haven't even seen how bad it's going to get yet in the U.S. According to my sister, I mentioned this the third time now, working in the hospital, they haven't even got hit by the full burden yet. So when I think you see it getting much worse in the U.S., I think the stock market in the U.S. goes back down to 2,000, and the VN index goes to 600. Okay.
Manufacturing.
Yeah, this is a really good question. So the question is about what about the indirect impacts, and so we talked about here's the hit to manufacturing, here's the hit to tourism, and what about second order things? And the honest truth is that it's so hard to pull apart all the cross effects because, medical will be up, but IT probably going to be up because of things like what we're doing right now, but then there'll be other things that are down. Honestly, it was just too difficult to try to pull apart everything. Even on the slide here, I mentioned that we talked about domestic consumption growth and we tried to pull apart what's tourism and what's domestic. Even that was already really nightmare to do a bunch of calculations. So trying to assess what's going to go on in the economy and other side things, indirect effects, honestly, was just too difficult. And I mentioned at the outset that that I have still some pessimism, and part of the reason for my pessimism is because if there are going to be indirect impacts on stuff, except for the health industry, which is obviously going to get pumped up, most things will probably be a minus and not a plus. And so that is something we really were not able to get deeply enough into. For one thing, the statistical economic statistical data in Vietnam is still at the beginning. It's nothing like in the US where you have week by week information about, how much credit card spending. And here we really don't have enough information to get into that. Okay.
Education sectors and also the forecast apartment price.
No, I don't expect apartment prices to drop. Absolutely not. Okay, let me move on now to talk about the dong, and I might be this might be. I just realized I put a couple slides here about the dong, and I'm probably giving away the fact that when we at VinaCapital talk to foreign investors, this is a thing they're really, really concerned about. So that's why I probably delve into that a bit more. And come to think of it, that might not be as much of interest to this audience, just occurred to me. But let me say it anyhow. You can see on the charts here that the red line is the dong, and the gray line in the graph on the left, the gray line is we just took an average of Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and you see that the currency has been much, much more resilient than our regional peers. The graph on the right is all emerging markets currencies, and here again, the currency's been much more resilient. And I'm not really clear why I wanted to put this in, but I think it's just so shocking that I wanted to put it in, that you see how the dong, I mean, obviously, Vietnam has nothing to do with Mexico other than they're both emerging markets that sell a lot of stuff to the US. Mexico sells even more. But you see, like, wow, how resilient the dong has been compared to the Mexican peso. The peso is down like 32% this year. It's just stunning. So we've held up much better than they have. Am I missing something? Oh, hold on. Sorry, something is out of order here. And let me jump around. Oops. Oh, sorry, can I? No, one more down. Yeah. I think I gave you the wrong version. This very last slide here, yeah, which is also related to the dong. Okay. So again, I probably went a little bit too much detail about the dong, but it might be something that you're concerned about because that's what we get asked by our investors. And the short story is that because people were concerned, hey, in the financial crisis, the dong appreciated by 20, maybe even 25%, depending on what measure you look at. And we wanted to make the point that the reason that the dong has been so resilient this time around is because the country was really in much better shape coming in to this whole thing. And also there was a scare about, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, the dong for the first maybe about month of when all the COVID stuff came out, the dong had only depreciated, I'm talking about the unofficial value of the dong had only depreciated by like 0.5%, basically. And then suddenly we jumped to about a 3% depreciation, and then we come back a little bit from that. And what happened at that time, there were two things going on. This is about two and a bit weeks ago. One was that there was some foreign selling on the stock market. They sold about around 260 million in 1 week. By the way, in the month of March, I think, if I remember off the top of my head, I think the total outflows in the stock market was around 500 million, something in and around there, and that compares to like minus 83 billion in worldwide. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there were enormous outflows from emerging markets, stock markets, and bond markets back. People taking their money out of them. But here we had some, but it really wasn't nearly as dramatic as in, and certainly not as dramatic compared to our regional peers here, Thailand, Malaysia, et cetera. But what had happened that time about 2 weeks ago was that there was 260 million sold on the stock market, and unlike back in 2018, foreigners also still sold stocks, but when they sold the stocks, they left the money here in Vietnam. And this time around, when they're selling, they're actually taking the money out of the country. And so there was a bank, there was one bank in particular that was scrambling around to get this $260 million that they could give to the investor, who wanted to take his money out of Vietnam. And that caused a little bit of a snowball of concern about, hey, what if the central bank, what if they don't let people take the money out of the country? What if they do some capital controls or something like that? And there was a little mini kind of panic or rumor that went around that week, and that was one of the main reasons why the currency sort of suddenly depreciated. And then it just the central bank said, reiterated, hey, we've got 85. It's actually higher now. It's $85 billion of FX reserves. The total amount of money that people have poured into the stock market here, it's probably around 15 billion. I mean, it's a huge number, but it's not anything that we couldn't just handle from our reserves directly. And this was information through sort of the informal network. I don't think they ever made an official announcement about this. And then I think they even officially came out and said, look, we're going to defend the dong if it gets past about the 23,900 level or so. That was something that they came out and said. And then the other topic on the dong about why we think that we're not so worried about, or why it's been just amazingly resilient, is that before all this COVID stuff hit, we were actually expecting the dong to appreciate starting from next year. So, we don't know how the world's going to look. You can't really make that kind of prediction right now. You need to see how things settle after all this. But if the COVID had not happened, it was pretty clear that we were embarking on a period where the currency was about to appreciate. And so that's, there was some inherent strength there, and that could be another reason why the currency has remained so resilient. By the way, one other thing that caused a little bit of downward pressure on the dong at some point was that there's an interesting phenomenon going on in the world right now, which is that many of you may know that the price of gold in the world is actually going down. And that's because there's selling of gold by institutions for a couple of different reasons. Long story short, they basically need to make a margin call. So if you're let's say you're I don't know, Elon Musk, and you have an account at some Swiss bank, something or other, and basically what they'll do is they loan these people money against their if you're a billionaire but all your stock is tied up in your company, they'll lend you some money, and then you can take that money and invest in other things or spend it or this kind of stuff. One of the things that people invested in was gold, and then when the value of kind of their core holding went down, then UBS or whoever your private bank is comes back to you and says, hey, your Tesla shares are worth less now than what they were before, so you need to pony up a bit more margin. And so what was happening is that people were selling their gold, because gold has gone up, had gone up throughout this. So they sold their gold and they used that money to make their margin call. And so that has been happening in the world. And at the same time, retail people have been aggressively buying gold, and I think very wisely so, by the way. I think if you look at the amount of money that they're printing in the US, you're going to see really big increase in gold prices over those next 5-10 years. But long story short, this was also happening in Vietnam. And so what was happening in Vietnam was you were starting to see a reemergence, which we haven't seen for years, of the premium between the price of gold in Vietnam and the price of gold in the world. And so that was another factor that was kind of temporarily putting a bit of pressure on the currency. But that seems to have abated now, and so the currency is, for the time being, is stable. I think it will stay stable. Okay, there's another question here, which is, can you share your thoughts on banking liquidity and NPL? So liquidity in Vietnam is really, really not an issue, and as evidenced by the fact that, I mean, it's incredible that throughout this whole thing, the interbank rates have, I think, still stuck at I think right now is about 2.2, 2.3%. I mean, which is incredible. And so the liquidity issue ties back, the liquidity in the banking system issue ties back to something I mentioned earlier, which is that the easiest way for them to really pump up things is to start spending copious amounts of money on infrastructure. Well, if they do that, the unintended consequence of that is then you could have liquidity issues in the banking system, because right now what's been happening is you've been actually seeing the deposit rates at a lot of banks actually coming down a bit now. So and one of the reasons why is the banks have this enormous pool of liquidity. I mentioned that the government over the last couple of years, they raised money by selling Vietnam government bonds, but they didn't actually spend the money on infrastructure projects, and therefore they just sort of essentially deposited the money back in the banking system. So if you were to see, a proper ramp up of infrastructure spending, that would actually drain liquidity out of the banks. But that's not. I mean, so far what they have announced is, you may have read in the newspaper that there's this section of the north-south highway where the eastern section north-south highway that's split into these 8 sub-projects, and the government is saying, and these were previously meant to essentially be sort of private sector funded, or PPP, or whatever you want to call it, but basically the money come from the private sector. And so far what the government's announced is, we're going to spend $1.5 billion probably in the second half of this year on 3 of those sub projects. And then they also announced about 2 weeks after that, they said, oh, maybe we'll take over all of those 8 sub projects, which would be about $5 billion. But then when you look into the details, it's still probably the case that the $1.5 billion would be sort of spent right away this year, but those other sub projects are 2021, 2022. So from a banking system liquidity point of view, that wouldn't have an impact. So the main thing we're watching for banking system liquidity would be really if you see money draining out to spend on infrastructure. The other part of this question was, what about NPLs? I had stated earlier that I really don't expect much impact on the domestically oriented real estate market, by which I mean things around 1,200, 1,500 per square meter. I'm not talking about the high-end luxury stuff, which has been either Chinese investors or VQ people paying for this stuff. And typically that there's no loan involved in that. So that's not going to have an impact on the NPLs. We are not really overly worried about, as I said before, the only subsegment I'm a little bit worried about is you've had an enormous growth in consumer lending. I'm not going to name any names, but everyone knows who the 1 or 2 banks or subsidiaries of banks that have been hyper aggressive in that segment. We all know who that is. And so I think there are a few select banks that are going to see their consumer financing loans that they made over those last 2-3 years, they're going to have some challenges. But from a systemic, like in terms of the health of the overall banking system, this is still not really a major issue. Consumer lending in Vietnam is still about 20% of GDP. Probably about half of that is mortgages. So you're probably looking at really only about 10% of GDP worth of proper lending against a guy's paycheck. Versus, I mean, in Thailand is like 60, 70% of GDP, humongous numbers. Of course, they have a lot of auto loan stuff there too that we don't have. So I'm not so worried about that. Okay, so that there's no more question in the queue now. Is that right?
So.
Is that right?
Oh, there was one more.
Oh, there's one more. Okay. 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 So pressure on the demand side for manufacturing and exports, and when do you expect external demand to return to its pre-COVID level? And you know what? That ties into the next part of my presentation. So let me talk a little bit about what I wanted to speak about next, and hopefully that will answer the question. And if it's not, please ping it again. So let me. I got to get back up because okay. So now we're down. Okay, so that's a finish of the discussion about the dong. Now let me talk about what I think happens after COVID. So the medical impact in the developed world, basically all year this year, before life kind of looks back to normal. The medical emergency in the US peaks in May. The virus comes back in the autumn for sure. So more social distancing, more not really a full resumption of economic activity in the US. And then on top of that, you have that the measures. I mean, I have to applaud what they're doing in the UK and Germany, as far as I understand, is the government is essentially saying to companies, you're going to have workers that you underutilize right now, and we're going to pay. We'll cover something like 80% of the cost of the salaries of those workers. Which I think a very rational way to handle that. And by the way, that's basically what Germany did during the global financial crisis, and that in terms of employment, work well for them. So what's being done in the U.S. is this mega fiscal stimulus. And I mentioned already that the money already is having a hard time to get to the people who need it. Half of employment in the U.S. is in small businesses. It turns out that if you're a small business, they promised, I think it was around 300 billion or something in aid to small businesses. Well, it turns out if you're a small business and you never borrowed money from the bank before, I don't mean you don't have a bank account. I mean, you never had a loan from a bank before. It turns out that you're not eligible for aid. I mean, which is just crazy. So like, I keep referring to my sister. My sister's husband is a wedding photographer. I mean, there's not going to be many weddings, obviously, but he employs a few people. He went to his bank and said, look, I never borrowed money from you before because I've always been a prudent guy and try to handle myself fiscally responsible. But I'd like to keep these guys employed, so I want to borrow their salary. And the idea was that if you borrow money to pay people and then you keep them on, you don't fire them, that eventually the U.S. will forgive the loan. And then his bank said, well, you never had a loan with us before, so we can't help you. We can't give you the money. That's just one example. I mean, there's going to be many more examples that come out. So in the case of the U.S., you will see, as I mentioned earlier, not just from the medical point of view, but also from the demand point of view, that the economy is going to be really weak for the next 2 years. However, what I think that means is that the demand for these Walmart type products, I think it's going to come back right away next year, because there's people like my parents that are basically middle class, that they were kind of splurging a little bit before and shopping in a store like Nordstrom, which in the U.S. is like a little bit upmarket type store, and they're going to shop at Walmart, and this Walmart sources their stuff from China and Vietnam, and you're going to see that people are not going to want to make stuff in China anymore. Okay, that's just a little bit more of a longer term story, but I guess to answer more directly the question, when will demand recover? I think it's going to be really from next year. I think around the middle or the end of next year, you'll see levels come back to normal. Sorry, I'm being a bit disjointed now because I wanted to answer that question, but then I got sidetracked from my thing here. So here's what I see happening post COVID. The first, by the way, I'll just mention one other thing. Everything is coming out so quickly, and I had an opportunity this morning. I could either, because usually when I do these kind of presentations, I like to practice it one time, so it's a little bit more fluid. And I thought to myself, well, I can use this morning getting the very, very, very latest information, which is what I chose to do, or I can, use it to practice going through this presentation one time. So that's why I'm a little bit all over the place. And the very, very, very latest information, by the way, that I read this morning is that you may have heard about the drug called chloroquine, which has got some controversy. And there's a few studies that are coming out and saying if you take chloroquine at the very, very early stage of the onset of the disease, it turns out it may be more effective than what we've been led to believe. And that's some research. I need to read the research a little bit more, but that's what I was into this morning. Okay, what do I expect post-COVID? The biggest thing is, which we're not really hearing about yet, is there's going to be a huge intensification of the US-China trade war. That's for sure coming. What I think you're going to see happen is the electronics supply chain is going to more or less relocate from China, or big chunks of it, I should say, because we don't have the capacity to absorb all of it. But big chunks of the electronics supply chain are going to come to Southeast Asia and to some extent to India, and big chunks of the auto parts industry are going to get relocated to Mexico. One of the things that there's some research that about what happens to an economy after a pandemic, And one of the things that happens is that, which is probably not that surprising, is that there's upward pressure on wage inflation. So wages tend to go up. Might be a little bit different this time, just because of the nature of who the disease is targeting. Tends to be people who are a little bit older. But we should expect that there will be upward wage pressure in countries like the U.S., obviously Italy, to some extent Germany. And so although the trade war will intensify, that's obvious, and although there will be a push, and it doesn't matter who gets elected the next president, whether it's Trump or whoever, there's going to be a push, a desire to pull production back to the U.S. The reality is that wages in the U.S. Are going to have some upward pressure. So although there will be a desire to get out of China and pull things back to the developed world, that's not going to be entirely possible. And so what you're going to see is production moving more and more moving here to Vietnam. And I'll talk just a little bit more about that on my next slide. And the other phenomenon you're going to see is there's going to be enormous flows of money into emerging market stock markets. Now, many of you will know that in the last decade, the central banks, particularly in Europe and in the US, conjured out of the air, this is the so-called quantitative easing, enormous amounts of money. And that did benefit emerging markets somewhat, but an enormous amount of money actually stayed in the US. And what happened was that as I had mentioned on one of my earlier slides, basically these companies in the US took the money and they just bought back their own stocks. Now, to give you some feeling about the wall of money that's being created, I put it on my slide here, that the Fed has created, just conjured out of the air, over $1 trillion of new money over the last 2 weeks. And what you can see here is during the financial crisis, I mean, this is already a 1/3 of what they did over 6 years. So it took them 6 years to create $3.5 trillion out of the air, and they've done 1/3 of that already in the last 2 weeks. So that gives you some sense about the amount of wall of money that's being created. The Fed themselves. And this has nothing to do with COVID. This is the Fed is a huge organization. They publish tons of research papers. Some parts of the Fed don't even know what's going on in other parts of the Fed, but they have a very good prediction model that essentially says no more increase in the U.S. stock market over the next decade. This is basically what to expect over the next decade. And so it's another point I have to come back to. All right, so I introduced these 2 points, and then I have 2 slides that get into more details on this. Probably not the best way to organize the information, but okay. So I introduced the topic of FDI flooding into Vietnam. Let me talk a bit more about that now. We've already starting to see some announcements by suppliers of Apple Computer and others, and this is after all the COVID stuff broke, that I think there was an article on Bloomberg that was titled something like iPhone suppliers accelerate their rush to get out of China, something to that effect. And it's also emerged that as early as 2015, there were internal debates and arguments within Apple Computer that at that time they were already saying, hey, we're really too reliant on China, and what if something happens, social stability or something like that. And at that time, the decision was, well, we're making a lot of money, and it will be costly to kind of replicate, even on a small scale, what we've done with the supply chains here in China to other countries. So at that time, they just sort of didn't put that topic off. And so the topic has already been out there for a while, that the vulnerability of having too much of your supply chains concentrated in China. And the most important point that I can make, and this I don't see anyone talking about this yet, is that one of the things we often heard during the trade war is when people started talking about, there was already this phenomenon of people moving their factory from China to Vietnam, and that was happening already just because the wage in China had already gone up. And then when the trade war happened, it was our opinion that this is just going to accelerate what was going on already. So the trade war takes an existing phenomenon of people moving factories from China to Vietnam, and the trade war is going to make it go faster. And that is kind of the way that it played out. However, when the trade war started to bubble up, what you heard from people is, yeah, we'd like to move our factory to Vietnam, but or places like Vietnam, but in China, there's this huge supply chain network. So, any gizmo, any gadget we want, we can just go down to in Shenzhen, go to the, electronics huge market there and get anything, basically. Well, the thing that was not really so discussed at that point, because it's maybe not the polite topic of discussion amongst business people, was that this supply chain in China, the reason that the supply chain in China was so much better than in places like in Vietnam, this amazing supply chain that they had in China, it didn't just like come out of the air magically. I mean, there was a concerted effort made both by the companies themselves and through some other nefarious things, also copying, stealing technology and stuff of this nature. But the point here is that the way that these supply chains got set up in China was a deliberate effort. And what I'm very clear is going to happen now going forward is you're going to see much more deliberate effort of those tech companies to not just use Vietnam's cheap labor to assemble things, but to actually really start properly building out the supply chain here now, because it's going to be in their own interest to do this going forward. And this is really going to dramatically lift Vietnam's growth potential. Because, I had sort of mentioned earlier that when we talk to foreign investors in London, New York, we really like to make a big deal about the fact that, Vietnam, high tech, and a third of the products we export now are, Samsung and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is all we're doing is importing the complicated bits that are made in other places, sticking them together. Maybe they make the box in Vietnam right now and some packaging things, but the real juicy stuff is not really made here yet. And that's because in these discussions that have emerged, that took place in China all the way back in 2015, it really is because the companies just felt at that time, that it seems to be working okay to just have all the juicy parts made in Korea and China. That's going to change for sure. And I think this is probably the single biggest game changer that's going to come out of all of this from Vietnam's point of view. And then, on the previous slide, I had split in two parts. So that's about the FDI, and then why is money going to flood into the stock market here? The investment returns in the U.S. and the U.S. and in Europe they're never going to rebound after this. The U.S. is now the U.S. is the next Japan. We had already been setting up for that for years to come. There's been an enormous amount of debt that's been taken on in the U.S. The demographics in the U.S. are really poor now, and so what you're going to see is really poor investment returns in the U.S. going forward. And at the same time, the pension funds in the U.S. are essentially bankrupt. They've assumed 6-7% investment returns. They're not going to be able to achieve those returns, and they're going to have to invest money in places like Vietnam. And the pension funds are going to be desperate to get a 6-7% return. They're going to be desperate for that. And I had one other point on this slide here I wanted to illustrate is so we're looking at probably $5 to $7 trillion of quantitative easing money printing over the next 2 years. These are unfathomably large numbers. So I tried to give make a real concrete example here, which is that the stock market went up 50% or almost 50% in 2015 and 17. This was almost entirely due to the fact that we had there was these elections in France and in Italy in 2017. And so the European Central Bank pumped an enormous amount of money into Europe's economy because they wanted to keep things, vibrant, because they didn't want these populist guys to get elected. And about half of the money that they pumped into the European economy at that time, about half of the money left. A lot of it came to emerging markets in places like Vietnam. And so 1 trillion of QE in Europe pumped our stock market up 50%. That gives you a feeling of what's coming ahead, both for, I hate to say it, for gold prices. My background, I have a very orthodox finance background. I worked in JP Morgan and Credit Suisse, and no one will ever talk about the word gold. They will think you're very, very strange if you mention the word gold, but that is unfortunately gold in emerging markets like Vietnam is going to be what's going to benefit from this. Okay, we have a question here.
No, we already answered this.
Oh, we answered that one.
Yes, when you expect.
Oh, that's it. Okay.
Yeah.
No more questions.
No more, and you might want to.
Good timing.
Yeah.
Because I think we have about 5 minutes left or so. If there's any other last questions, are we going to distribute this?
Yes.
Because I'm sorry, I accidentally gave you the wrong. I'll give you another version which has just some small changes.
Okay, sure.
And has the slides in the right order as well. So.
Thank you.
Anything else?
I think for now there's questions.
Okay, I want to thank you for your time. I obviously I really hope everyone will, from a health perspective for yourselves and from your for your own families, we'll get through this okay. And please wear face masks, even if it's not perfect. It's very effective. Okay. Do you think Vietnam corporate bond is too risky at the moment? Absolutely not. I think that Vietnam corporate bonds are really, I didn't put it in my presentation because it's like too much information, but corporate bonds in Vietnam is very, very good investment. What we focus on is something we call the credit spread, which is sort of like what the bond is paying versus what government bonds pay. And that information gives you clues about, there's two things there. It's the possibility that the company could go bankrupt. And if they do go bankrupt, like how much would you as an investor be able to recover? This actually happens to be another area that I have some expertise in. If you Google my name, you'll see I have the CFA, which is the Chartered Financial Analyst. I actually wrote the CFA's guide for mathematically analyzing these kind of risks, credit risks. So it's a long story, but I actually think in fact, even inside VinaCapital, I've been trying to get us to go in that direction to set up a bond fund that we could tout to foreigners. The problem for foreigners is that they want to see like a ratings agency, and of course we don't have that in Vietnam. But there's other ways you can estimate the risk of Vietnam corporate bonds, even without having a ratings agency here. There's something, if you happen to have access to a Bloomberg machine, or someone that works in finance that has access to a Bloomberg machine, is there is something called the Altman, ALTMAN. Altman is a professor at I can't remember if it's MIT or maybe New York, maybe NYU, maybe New York University. But what Altman does, there's something called the Altman Z-score. And the Altman Z-score is a way to look at the probability that a company will go bankrupt based on things like, how its cash flow and how much money it has on its balance sheet and things like that. So if you do an Altman Z analysis of corporate bonds in Vietnam, you would find that you're getting very good returns compared to the risk that you're taking. You have to use your common sense, but in general, most of the corporate bonds here is very good, I think. Yeah. And
okay,
sorry, is there
we have one
yeah,
more
yeah.
from Henry.
Yeah.
Is that you said quite emphatically that you thought COVID-19 would stop people buying luxury apartments. Sorry,
to clarify, I did not, or either I didn't say or I didn't mean to say luxury. In fact, I do think the luxury segment will get hit because that's primarily to foreign investors, realistically. And I think so. Therefore, that will get hit with the general depression of the economy that you'll see in the U.S. and China. What I am very clear is that the domestic. So I'm talking about the mid-tier, things around 1,200, 1,500. The products of people like Novaland. I'm not trying to tout any particular company, but Candian, Novaland, Namlong. I think people like that will do well. So if the government can do the measures to unfreeze, because the big issue in the real estate market right now is that the supply is frozen. So the point that I was trying to make there is that if they were able to do the measures to unfreeze the supply, you would see a lot of domestic buying of apartments. And that's because, number one, there's pent up demand. And number two, because I think that the after effects, and again, I want to really not be insensitive in what I say, because I know it's, this is a terrible human tragedy, and a lot of people's lives will be affected. But as I mentioned earlier, the statistic from the Pew Research Center that in the U.S., there's a very big divergence between what people perceive as the health risk from COVID and the risk to the economy. I really think that if you were to take a similar survey here in Vietnam, that divergence would be even larger. Because the government's done a really good job keeping it under control, and we're already used to wearing face masks. People will start to understand very quickly that face masks are very effective in blocking hand washing and hygiene measures. So I think that there'll be a rebound in domestic economic activity here, not foreigners. So I think that the luxury segment would continue to have a hard time. Okay, do you expect a plunge in prime area property in the next 12 months? No, I don't. No.
Okay, I think there's one more.
Wow, a lot of questions about real estate. Another question about real estate. Okay, hold on. Given that there's so many questions about real estate, let me just make sure. Let me take an inventory in my head and make sure I didn't miss anything that I needed to say on this topic. I just don't see the demand and the price of, I'm talking about apartments for emerging middle class people to buy, to live in. If you talk about rent to let, for Airbnb or something like that, yeah, that's going to get hit. But if you talk about District 4, if you talk about stuff in Tan Binh District, no, I District 9, I don't think these places are going to suffer a big decline. Wow, if I knew there was going to be so many questions on this topic, I would have tried to think through more concrete about my arguments. But I think my arguments are tied into the idea that there will be I can't speak for Hanoi, but just in coming today to the British consulate, I see people everywhere. I mean, we're supposed to be in a lockdown, and I see people and economic activity happening everywhere. And this is when we're in the middle of the lockdown. So you have to go by numbers and statistics, not just what you observe with your eyes. But I just see so many reasons to believe that there's going to be a vibrant recovery of domestic economic activity. And again, all the epidemiological stuff that I've studied and having a bit of background in this makes me think that, and combination with the good, with the government, how they've handled it really well so far, I have to say, makes me think that the medical part of this is going to be over at the end of H1. Okay.
Let's take the final questions.
Yeah.
On auto market and
auto market. Wow, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. My answer is I haven't thought about it, but my intuition is that I don't think it's. I mean, outside of my comments about domestic demand in general, people wanting to go back to restaurants, people wanting to, buy another iPhone. I don't see anything special about autos different than the rest of that. Are people going to want to wear? Are people going to want to buy an auto because they feel safer than they do in a motorbike? No, I don't think so. Yeah, on the top of my head, I can't think of anything intelligent to say about autos versus any of the other domestic-oriented businesses. People going back to the gym, people, things of that nature. So.
Okay. I think that is the final questions for today.
Thank you so much for giving me your time today. I know that there's so much information about COVID, and there's so many podcasts and information, and you have the option of getting information from a lot of points of view. So I do very appreciate the time that you took to listen to my and our views on this topic today. So thank you, and please be well, be healthy.